Dr. Chuck the Science Schmuck. Synchronize. Okay. Hello, everybody. As you can see, I've already got the Schmuck vision on because I think I'm going to need it today. Now, what I'm talking about today isn't any complicated scientific demonstration. There's a staple on my table, and now there isn't. What I want to do today is a size comparison. Uh, that sounds incredibly dull, but I found it interesting when I was doing the math. Because, yes, I sit there and I do math for fun. Now, what I was wondering is, since I have an interest in biology, I like studying the scale of living things. I thought, well, it's often hard to get a grasp of how small or big things are without comparing them to everyday objects. So, I created, that's why my computer is up here, I created this spreadsheet which mathematically defines scale differences based on, you can see it behind me, we're working on this scale, 0.25 nanometers to 1 millimeter. Now, why that specifically? Well, if you break down the periodic table, which I don't have, I should probably get a shower curtain of it, because a poster would be too expensive. According to this, the size of the largest atom in terms of radius, which is kind of a funny thing to say because atoms don't really have quite a defined radius. They're very wobbly, kind of squishy. But it's cesium with a width of 0.265 nanometers empirically, which that's logical. Any of the first group elements like cesium, they have one electron in the valence, and it's trying to leave as best it can. It's just spinning around, going places. So it's way out of orbit from the rest. So that's really big. The smallest atom being hydrogen, which is roughly a tenth the size of cesium, which is very, very tiny. It's like 0.02 nanometers. That's very small. So, how do we scale this up to that? Well, I say the smallest thing I can really find is 1 millimeter wide. Any smaller than that, and I can't see it. So, I've converted that, the largest atom, cesium, at about 0.25, which is about a quarter of a nanometer, compared to this. Now, this is what the Schmuck vision is for. As you can see on this plate, there is a tiny... Schmuck vision, why have you betrayed me? Well, as you can see on this plate, if I've done the editing properly, there is a tiny black dot. That tiny black dot, I'm trying to get a good view for you on my viewfinder. That tiny black dot right there is one tobacco seed. Now, you ask, why do I have tobacco seed instead of any normal seed? The answer is roughly because I believe the technical term for the measurement is a metric butt ton of them, which is slightly larger than a normal butt ton, but smaller than a nautical butt ton. I have tons of these. Now, that tiny tobacco seed is about a millimeter wide. So we are going to say that that tiny little seed, 1 millimeter, I mean, if you can't see this seed, go find yourself a poppy seed bagel, take a poppy seed off. It's the same size as a tobacco seed. I just don't have poppy seeds because, you know, I don't have money for poppies. I have money for tobacco, apparently. I don't smoke it. I don't eat it. In fact, the breed I grow, I can't eat or smoke because it's toxic. It just grows really well. So it's fun for me because it feels satisfying. But anyway, that tiny seed is our cesium atom. That little tiny dot, you can barely see it. You can't see it at all, really. That tiny little dot is one cesium atom, scaled up to that scale. So this is actually a lot bigger than a cesium atom. Now, comparing that to other living things, therefore, the next thing up on the list is the porcine circovirus. I've never heard of that until like yesterday, but apparently it's one of the smaller species of virus. A lot of the phage is tiny, but phage is funny shaped. It's long and very thin. This one's more roundish. It's 17 nanometers wide. So translating that, that comes to a size of about 6.8 centimeters, which is about the size of this rubber ball that I found on the ground in a field. I don't know what sport this is for. No idea. But if you peg this at someone's head, it would hurt a lot. So, compared to our one cesium atom, this is the size of the world's smallest virus that's yet understood or known. Now, that's a very tiny virus. Compare that to, for example, a flavivirus, which are my preferred virus, although normal people may not know what they cause. Think West Nile virus or yellow fever. Those are caused by flaviviruses. A flavivirus is also about the size of a coronavirus, which causes common colds sometimes, along with like 300 other viruses. They are usually around 50 nanometers wide because they're a membrane-bound virus, which translates to a size of about 20 centimeters. So this fishbowl, that's the smallest virus. This is a flavivirus or a coronavirus or several of those mid-sized viruses. It's bigger compared to one atom. That's pretty large. But still, compared to other things, that's pretty small. So the world's largest virus is mimiviruses, which are a type of Pandora virus. They're a virus that infects amoeba. Famously, they were discovered in Arctic ice in Siberia, but now it's known that they're sort of ubiquitous. The size of a mimivirus is about 390 nanometers wide, which is massive for a virus, but still very small. So that translates to, because now we go beyond centimeters, and since I'm American, I can't... metric is weird because there's not a intermediate size. It goes from centimeters, which there's a whole lot of, to meters, which there's very few of, so you don't have a unit that's like this big. And I think, as an American, I think of everything in units about this big, so I'm converting to feet, because my brain thinks in segments this big. I can't say, well, that's 30 centimeters, and I can't say, well, that's a meter, because that's a yard. So we're converting to feet. A mimivirus in this scale is 156 centimeters, which is about 5.2 feet, which this table is about that long. It's slightly shorter than that. So imagine that this table was a giant virus. This table is a virus for the point of this scale exercise. Again, one atom, the smallest virus, the biggest virus. Now we start moving up in scale. Viruses are very small. They don't perform metabolic functions. Mimivirus comes close. It has a lot of pieces that viruses don't normally have, but it's not alive. It doesn't perform biological features as is. The next stage up in terms of life would probably be bacteria. Now, the smallest form of free-living bacteria, which is, according to this, Pelagiobacter ubique, isn't really that different from E. coli in terms of size. So we're going to go with E. coli. E. coli, everybody uses E. coli. It's very common biologically. It's present in all people. They say, oh, you get E. coli food poisoning. That's a special form of E. coli. It's normal E. coli is basically harmless. They're long, sort of skinny. I mean, not spirochete long, but sort of long and fat. And they're not this big either. That's very small. And E. coli would be, according to this, about 13 feet long and 6.5 feet wide. So, let me take my demonstration on the road here. That would mean that a normal E. coli cell in this proportional makeup would be about the size of my car. Now, compare that to the table versus the ball or the fishbowl. That's a lot bigger. Bacteria are huge, because now we have a system that has a complicated cellular function. But then we break out into eukaryotes. Now, the camera should be stabilizing this. It may not be a very clear picture, but you can see my backyard leading to the fence. That's about 90 feet from here to there over my massively overgrown garden. if you were to compare that to something, then you have a red blood cell. A red blood cell is approximately, in this scalar equivalent, about 90 feet. Red blood cells are comparatively small cells, so that's a pretty good size compared to my car. You just have this giant donut that would just cover everything. And that would be a red blood cell. A normal human cell would probably be slightly larger. So, really big. Versus, you know, going all the way down to a virus. Like this type of virus, a flavivirus, infects human cells. So, my entire property, I don't own the property, I rent it. So, this entire property would be a cell. This is the thing that infects it. So you saw my backyard. Imagine, you know, there's another 40 feet in the front yard. It's pretty big. It's nice. Until you have to shovel the driveway in the winter and there's this much snow. But all it takes is this to infect all that. But continuing to move up in scale. So the largest bacteria is about 7,000 nanometers wide, which is actually huge for a bacteria. That is so large you'd be able to see it with the naked eye. It would actually, in real life, be as big as the tobacco seed. That one would be roughly 4,000 feet, which is not quite a mile. It's like 0.7 miles. So that's, I don't even really have something that scales to that. My road, going all the way from this to the main road, which you wouldn't even be able to see on this camera, which I might as well turn off at this point, it's not big enough to hold that. It's, imagine like a mile for the largest bacteria, but even then, since you probably will never see this bacteria, I've never seen it. I've never been in the water off the coast of Namibia. Maybe a better example, a fruit fly. Drosophila, they were instrumental in genetics research. They are ridiculously there's one right there. He's flying by. You can't see it because of the potato. I have thousands of them upstairs because I left some bananas in the garbage too long. If you leave a banana peel, it's a good idea for an experiment. I might do that later and just show you how to make fruit flies from bananas. They are very tiny. They're not big flies like house flies or horse flies, which, if you've lived in New York and you've seen a horse fly, it might as well carry off a horse. They're terrifyingly huge. It's like a hummingbird. But a fruit fly, ordinary harmless fruit fly, how big would that be with our scalar amount? Oh, well, let's check the list. A normal fruit fly is about 3 millimeters, so pretty small. But multiplied up by this rate, he would be 7.5 miles wide. That's really big. I mean, considering that my car is a bacteria. My backyard is one cell. 7 miles is a tiny fly. Versus, this is a virus. This is a virus. This is a very tiny virus. And that is one atom. That's not the whole plate. On the center, there's a tiny black dot. That tiny black dot that looks like a poppy seed is one atom, and a fruit fly is 7 miles wide. But let's move up a little bit. So what's the smallest, I almost said vertebrate, but vertebrates are weird because there's a lot of very tiny vertebrates. I think there's a frog that's like the size of a housefly. But the smallest mammal is called a pygmy gyroba, which most people haven't even heard of what a gyroba is. You can look it up. It's sort of cute. It's really weird looking. Most gyrobas look a little strange. If you don't have a lookup system around you, they're kind of like a mouse, but they have long back legs like a kangaroo rat, except they're not a kangaroo rat. They're a different species that looks similar. The pygmy gyroba grows up to 2 inches long. It's adorably tiny, but freaky looking. If you were to scale up the pygmy gyroba to that, he would be 128 miles long. So, I mean, in real life, a pygmy gyroba is not even as big as this ball, which is standing in for our porcine circovirus. He'd be dwarfed by this. He'd be like, oh yeah, I'm only half of that. He would reach from here, which is roughly in Syracuse, to Albany. And if you've ever driven from Syracuse to Albany, down 90 one? I don't know. There's only one highway that goes west. Figure it out. I don't know what it's called. It takes forever. It's like a 3-hour drive, just gunning it. No traffic. It just goes forever. It takes forever to get there. That's a long distance. That's how big a pygmy Joroba is if this is an atom. Now, moving up a little bit from the smallest mammal, how about an ordinary mammal? A Manx cat. Now, why a Manx cat specifically? Because the measurement I got excludes the tail. Ordinary cat, house cats are about, excuse me, an ordinary house cat is about 18 inches long, excluding the tail because it's a Manx cat, which by this translates to about 1,154 miles, which is, remember, considering that one cell in that cat is the whole size of my backyard, one bacteria living on that cat is the size of my car, and that cat is made out of atoms the size of this seed. That cat, if he had his butt here in Syracuse, his head would be in Denver. Denver is that way. That's south. That's north. That's east. That's up. There's also a down, but I don't like going that way very much. Well, actually. But anyway, moving up again in scale, a person. I'm a person. A normal person is about 6 feet tall. If you're less than 6 feet tall, that's okay too. If you're more than 6 feet tall, you probably hit your head on things. Like that. I hit my head almost every time I go through there. But I'm not more than 6 feet tall. It's just this house was built in the 30s and everyone was shorter. A person who is 6 feet, about 6 feet tall, would be 4,619 miles tall. Which would mean that if you were to stand up, the International Space Station would be hitting your knees. If you were to lie down, well, that depends. If you lie down facing west, your feet here in Syracuse, your head is on Hawaii. If you lie down east, your feet are here in Syracuse, your head's on Moscow. Interestingly, I'm at the midpoint between Moscow and Hawaii. If you ever needed to know that, it's roughly where New York is. That's really tall, and that's a really long distance. That would take, even flying straight, that's, I think the longest flight I ever took was to Poland, which was like a 14-hour flight. You're going even further to get to Moscow. It's like a, I don't know, a 20-hour flight. I don't even know if they do direct flights to Hawaii from here. But still, that's a long, long, long distance. Considering that a yellow fever virus this big, just a couple of these, could kill a person whose feet are in Syracuse and whose head is in Moscow. Like 5 of these, and he's dead. If that's yellow fever. Now, the largest animal that I could find that still exists, because there were historically giant whales and giant sharks that were larger, but the largest modern whale, the blue whale, is about 80 feet long, which is huge. If you've ever been in a museum, which I do recommend going to a museum, if you're boring like me, they are very fun, especially for kids. I loved museums as kids. It's a nice place to take kids. Probably not art museums, because art museums are boring, but ones where they have a whale, not a live one. You can't keep them in captivity. But a blue whale scaled up by this would be 61,565 miles long, which that doesn't really have any meaning. We're to the measure of distances where, like, I can say that number, but you don't know what that means necessarily unless you're very good at geography. But basically, he pulls a Jormungandr, actually pulls 2.5 Jormungandrs, and goes around the entire circumference of the Earth, 2.5 times. So whales aren't actually that flexible, and also he would be a lot wider than the Earth, but, well, maybe as wide. I didn't calculate the width of a whale because I don't know the width of a whale. I would have to get a tape measure and jump in the water, and I can't swim, so I would get eaten by the whale, because whales eat plankton, and I'm basically a form of plankton, apparently. That's very funny to me. You don't need to think it's funny, because I think it's funny. I'm laughing on the inside. But anyway, this whale is giant. So I mean, if he stood up, which whales don't stand, but if you stood him up, he'd be a quarter of the way to the moon. Which brings us to the final item on the list, a sequoia tree, which there's a guy back over there who has a sequoia tree. It's not one of the giant ones. It's like, I'm in upstate New York. The forest is mostly maple and a few oak. And then you're just looking through and there's just this guy with a sequoia tree sticking in his backyard. It's really cool. But the actual California sequoias that have been there for 2,000 years instead of being planted in the 70s, the tallest among them, the tallest tree there is actually named Hyperion at present. But the tallest tree is, it's around 360 something, but there's several giant sequoias that are around the range of 350 feet, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that is a huge tree. That's a massive tree. Now, if you convert 350 feet into this format, it is 269,444 miles, which means that if you were to plant that tree on Earth, which its roots would be, the trunk is wider than Earth, so if you stretch that tree from Earth up, its branches would be touching the moon. Every time the moon goes by, it would scrape the top of the tree. That's how tall a tree would be if an atom was the size of this tobacco poppy seed. It's the size of a poppy seed. That is a very impressive size, which, again, I hope this exercise gives a perception of scale that maybe you didn't have. I didn't have this perception of scale till I really thought about it, especially with regard to viruses. We tend not to think just how small they actually are versus bacteria and things. Just the scale of life, that a bacteria the size of my car is just as alive as a blue whale that stretches around the Earth several times. Or a human whose knees are touching the International Space Station who's got his head in Moscow. It's kind of an amazing thing to think about in terms of chemistry and biology. So, mostly I just wanted to leave you with that thought. And perhaps in the next video, I will actually do something that you find interesting instead of just something that I find interesting. Thank you for watching. Don't bother hitting like or subscribe because it doesn't actually matter. Extra.